Hello, everyone. If someone could just let me know if you're hearing me, if you could just put something in the chat, just so I know you can hear what I'm saying. Awesome. Okay. Thank you. Hello, Dan. Thank you for, all right. And hello, Pascal, all sorts of people here today. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bill Laboon. I'm on the technical education team here at the Web3 Foundation. So what we're going to discuss today is how block production works in Polkadot. And I'm actually going to start at a very, very fundamental level before getting into depth on this. So if the first few minutes seem a little too foundational, if you're like, I already know what a hash is, you don't need to rehash this, haha. Please don't worry, we'll soon get into the real meat of the discussion, but I do want to make sure that everybody understands the basics of what a blockchain is and why consensus is so important. And I think you really need to have that foundation to understand how Babe and Grandpa work. So just another comment, please, if you have a question, I'll ask you to click the Ask a Question button, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and put it in chat. Feel free to do that at any time. I actually won't see it, but I'll pause the presentation after each section and go back and answer them. So it's a great way to just put the questions in, and then you can then I will answer them. You don't have to wait, or write them down yourself and wait to ask later. Just put them all in a nice queue for me to answer, and I'll answer at the end of each section. All right, so unless anyone's having any issues, then I think we can get started. So give me one moment here to start the screen. Okay, so we are screen sharing. So the title of our discussion today, we're going to cover both block production and finalization in Polkadot. So in Polkadot, and the same process is used for Kusama, which is our canary network. The Babe and Grandpa protocols are used. So even though I'm discussing this in terms of Polkadot, just know that Kusama is using the same basic principles. So as I mentioned, I do want to start with really fundamentally what is a blockchain. As I mentioned, if this is old hat to you, please just hang on for a few minutes. I really just want to make sure people understand the basics. So, really to understand blockchains, you really have to first understand what a hash function is. And all a hash function is given some arbitrary length string, any input of numbers or characters or whatever data, come up with some fixed sized value. So I have some examples actually here in the next slide using SHA-256, which is a very common hashing algorithm. These numbers are all in hexadecimal, in case you're unfamiliar with that. So we can see the SHA-256 hash of Polkadot, for example, is 225A6 ... Okay. You'll notice all of these, I have a very the same length number for each of them. So we can there are a lot of different algorithms that can be used for hashes, but for situations where we want security, such as in blockchains, there are a few other things that we want our hashes to have. So the first is hiding. That is, so give it sort of mathematically, given h of x, it's infeasible to determine x. What I mean by this is, given a hash like 225A6 ... it's very difficult to determine the other end of that function. Polkadot is the input. You can go one way very easily, but not backwards the other way. So this can be called a one-way function. It's collision resistant. That is, if I have some value x that hashes to, for example, 225A6, it's very difficult for me to find some other string besides Polkadot that maps to that same hash value. And finally, it should be puzzle friendly. That is, the easiest way to find the hash of a value is to just calculate the hash. There shouldn't be any shortcuts involved in it, no cheating. So really, the only way, the fastest way to do a hash is to actually do the calculations for the hash. So these aren't too important unless you're very interested in hashing and cryptography, but just know that we think of these as one-way functions, right? So if you have Polkadot, I can easily send it to, make sure that it's 225A, whatever. But notice that even changing a very minor detail in the second hash, I've capitalized the last T, and it gives me a very different hash value. And also notice that no matter how large of a string that I pass in, I'm always going to get the same size hash. All right. So I'm just going to double check, see if any questions note on hashing. As I said, the first few slides, they're rather foundational here. Something that is used quite often in blockchains are hash pointers. So a hash pointer is a pointer to some data or object, and then a hash of the data inside that object. So for example, if I have some bit of data, this talk is great, a hash pointer would just be a link to that as well as the hash. And so whenever I go to check to see did anything change in what I'm pointing to here, I can double check, this talk is great. And I get the exact same hash. I get, if I run the SHA-256 function on this talk is great, I get 1D309, whatever, and all is well. If somebody tries to modify that and some trader tries to say this talk is bad, but I have that same hash pointer, I know that something has changed because inside my hash pointer, I have 1D30 ... as the hash of the string inside of that. However, when I run a hash on the data there, I get EBF ... So we can tell that there was some sort of problem here. Something has changed. Either it was corrupted or somebody is trying to modify the data from underneath me. And if we take this idea and just apply it to a linked list, which is a pretty common programming data structure in programming, this is a simple blockchain. It's just a sequence of data that we use hash pointers to make sure that we're not corrupting the data. This data can be anything. In Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies, it's transactions, but as you see in a lot of other blockchains out there, it could be any kind of data. And if one of the great things about blockchains, they're tamper resistant. And the reason for that, if someone tries to modify something, for instance here, I have made a transaction, I've gotten rid of TX4, transaction 4, and this is going to cause my data to change, which causes all of my hashes to change, which means the head of the blockchain is going to have an incorrect hash value. So I know that it is there has been some modification to the data. So that's a basic blockchain, which is actually used in situations other than cryptocurrency. So for example, you could really consider Git, for example, as a kind of blockchain, just using hashes to keep track of what has been changed and what to avoid corruption, right, of data. So the real problem with blockchains is not creating some valid history. It's what is the canonical history that we can all agree upon. Because if we assume that all of these hashes are valid, so I just have H previous for previous, just assume that all of these hashes are valid here. But after is, I can see that there are there's like a fork in the road here, right? Either this talk is and then a good block, or this talk is bad and then a bad block. And if all of these hashes are valid, how can I know which is the canonical history that everybody agrees on? So what really sort of put blockchain on the map was Bitcoin, and it uses something called Nakamoto consensus. It's very difficult to make blocks. It's computationally difficult. So if we add a separate validating function here, that we say that the hash of the data inside every block has to start with a 0, for instance. And I'm going to assume that an underscore and any characters afterward are ignored in terms of data, but are calculated in terms of the hash. I can just keep trying different garbage data at the end until I find a hash of that block that starts with a 0. So here, I actually did these all by hand, typing them in. So it was a little bit of work. Good BB, good P1, good FF, good RX, good AI, until finally I get a hash that starts with 0. So now I can say that good AI, I've got a low value hash. I know that this is valid, whereas bad, they didn't do the work to make sure that it was below 0. And so I'm going to assume that the top path is canonical, that is the correct one. But there are some problems with this approach. So just starting a hash with 0 is not very difficult. I was able to do it by hand. However, Bitcoin does this, or an equivalent to this, quadrillions of times per second. This is what Bitcoin miners are doing. And right now, the Bitcoin network itself uses up more electricity annually than Switzerland. Okay, so it's very energy intensive. As there's a competition as more and more people. And Bitcoin has a way of modifying how much work you have to do so that blocks are always produced in 10-minute increments or thereabouts. And so it can only use use more and more electricity. So it's very energy intensive. And proof of work only provides probabilistic finality. If we assume that the longest chain, the chain that has the most work, is the correct one, there's no way to know for certain that you're on the exact longest chain and there's not a longer one out there. So I may have thought that this talk is good was the longest and most worked chain, but there's a very small chance that there's actually another blockchain out there, or a chain, excuse me. This talk is really very bad, that has more work and is truly is more final. Okay. Now in practice, this doesn't happen very often, but it's certainly something that can happen. All right, so I'm just going to pause for a second and make sure if there are any questions. I don't see any. Okay. All right, great. So I guess we had people who already understood the basics here. All right, so Polkadot, and I assume that most of you are familiar with Polkadot. We are going to really focus our talk on the relay chain itself and how it works. Parachains, aside from being able to connect to the relay chain, they can have all sorts of their own ways of doing things. I want to talk specifically about how the relay chain produces blocks. So just know that parachains can do this in other different ways. So recall that the relay chain is the main chain of Polkadot that holds the states of parachains and allows high-level interactions with itself. It's secured with proof of stake, not proof of work. So there are no miners, rather there are validators that produce blocks and finalize them. So they're going to produce blocks using a protocol called Babe and finalize them via Grandpa. So why did we do Polkadot? So remember some of the problems that I mentioned with Nakamoto consensus. It's probabilistic and it takes a lot of energy. Specifically for trying to avoid probabilistic finality, there are other mechanisms that can be used to avoid it and actually guarantee finality. So it's a very Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance and related finalizers. They have been around for quite a while, and at least under certain circumstances can prove finality and are very well tested. But the big drawback is on a very large network, they can be vulnerable to stalling. I mean, there are other drawbacks to them. That's the one I'm going to focus on here. So there's something you may have heard of called the cap theorem. That is, for any distributed system, you can have 2 of the 3 items listed here. So the system can always be consistent. That is, all the nodes on the system should eventually agree. It can be available. That is, it is always going to be live and producing, in our instance, producing blocks or doing things, or it can be partition tolerant, which means that if there is a network split, it can continue to operate. Now, in any distributed system, you're going to have to worry about partition tolerance. So that's something we really can't get away from. However, there are different approaches. These different approaches that we saw with Nakamoto consensus and PBFT take sides and whether they would like to keep consistency or availability. So Bitcoin and the idea of Nakamoto consensus and most blockchains out there prize availability over consistency. That is, there may be times when different nodes disagree with each other on what is the canonical blockchain. However, it will always be available. PBFT, on the other hand, prizes consistency over availability. So if there is some sort of inconsistency where some nodes think something is different or can't connect, the system may stall. That is, it may not be able to continue forward. Okay? However, it will always be consistent. So neither of these are quote unquote right, but both of them have certainly benefits to them. So Polkadot, with some conditions, we try to bring both consistency and availability along with partition tolerance. Now, there are some definite conditions here, which we're going to see. We haven't developed something that breaks cap theorem. However, what we're going to see is that by using two different mechanisms, one for producing blocks and one separate process for finalizing them, we can get some of the benefits of both worlds. So for a good trade-off of having a system which can have provable finality, but will also be very highly available. So BABE is what is used, blind assignment for blockchain extension. And that's BABE, think of like a baby. Like it's for young blocks. It's how new blocks are produced. Okay. So what happens? A very high level overview. We're going to go into the weeds in a moment here. Validators randomly select themselves to produce blocks and will generate new blocks this way based on the amount of stake that they have. Grandpa is a separate process which is going to poll the validators to come up with a final and canonical chain. So generally, once things are finalized, barring some major issue with the chain, they will be provably finalized. They will not change. Something that a block that has only been produced by BABE but has not been accessed by Grandpa, has not been finalized by Grandpa rather, this is liable to be modified. It may not be canonical. Okay. So if we think of the relay chain like this, again, just a very simple, relatively simple blockchain. Up to the red line, we know that barring some extremely unusual circumstances, this is finalized. It's not going to change. But blocks that are new and produced by BABE are not yet finalized. So they are subject to change. And we can see that, in fact, that there are some conflicting blocks here. Every time you see one of these purple magenta screens, I'm going to check for questions. So let's talk a little bit about BABE, which is how Polkadot produces blocks. So BABE is a proof-of-stake protocol. If you're familiar with Ouroboros-Prous, that it is very similar. Basically, we are going to split our time up into epochs that have slots. And these slots are going to be a place where a block can be produced. Okay. So as we're looking at this, as the validators get selected to build a block, they need to figure out what is the best chain of the chains that they can see. So for instance, here we've got that G for Genesis, and then some blocks. That red block is the last finalized block by Grandpa. So what we're going to try to do with basic babe is come up with the longest chain from the last finalized block. So we can see this black path is the quote-unquote best chain. It's what we want to build our block on top of when our validator is trying to decide what to build on. So we can see there are a couple of other possible chains. That one at the very bottom, it's seeing that, but it's not built on the last finalized block, so it's going to be ignored. We know that that's just a dead end chain. There are two other in the middle that are also perhaps seen by our validator, but they're not the longest chain after the finalized block. So the longest chain, including the last finalized block, is what we're going to build on top of and what we're going to consider the canonical chain. Just so you know, a lot of these situations that I'm showing where there are like multiple chains, they don't happen that often in practice. What we have been seeing, barring again some extraordinary circumstances or network issues, is that finalization is usually only 1 or 2 blocks behind the head of where Babe is producing new blocks. But obviously we do need to keep in mind what happens when that is not the situation. So I'm going to thank my colleague Handan for this wonderful animation. So what happens at the beginning of an epoch is that all the validators use their own keys and use some of the randomness from previous epochs to basically have a lottery and to run some hash functions to get some number and see if it's less than some value. And so what we have here is we're going forward. At the beginning of every epoch, we're rolling the dice and seeing deterministic, it's sort of weird. We're rolling the dice deterministically based on some, since they are pseudo-random numbers. Based on the randomness from previous blocks, we're going to generate randomness from previous blocks, and we determine which slot should we try to produce a block in. And you'll notice that sometimes there are slots that no validator produces a block for. And sometimes we have multiple validators in the same block. This is anticipated since we don't have anyone that is controlling this, any sort of authority over it, and we're doing things probabilistically and randomly. There is a very good chance that there will be multiple blocks produced in the same slot, and finalization will have to choose one of them over the other. As we get more validators coming online, this will be having no validators in a slot will be rarer and rarer, but always a possibility. However, we'll talk about that when we talk about improvements to the Babe protocol here. But I just want to show you the basic idea of it before we delve into filling in those extra slots. All right. So every validator, they have their own block signing keys, and they also have a lottery key, right? Some way of interacting with the lottery mechanism that others can, and they can prove that they've done a pseudo verifiably random function, as we call it. So this VRF, or verifiably random function, there are sort of 3 different aspects to it. So given the secret key and some value, you can generate a random number. But even more importantly, you can prove to others that you in fact created a random number. You didn't just make it up on your own, to try to always produce a block or do something malicious. So it's actually kind of a cool mathematical trick that you can verifiably prove that you created a random number to give yourself a spot in slots. So how it figures this out is given you concatenate some data together from the epoch to epochs past, as well as its own keys, a secret key, and produces some value. And just like we had, 0 had, you were a good valid block in our mini Bitcoin example. If V is less than that value, your produced random number, you are a block producer for that slot. So if that's the case, then you generate, you're a block generator. So you look for transactions or extrinsics that need to go in this block and create a block. And then you can then prove to everybody else that yes, in fact, I did have the right to create this block. So if anyone tries to challenge you, like a fisherman, you will be able to show that given the data that is on the blockchain, I was able to produce this pseudo-random number that says that I am allowed to produce a block here. However, if you didn't, for that particular slot, if your number was greater than or equal to that value, you'll collect blocks from everyone else. So someone else is creating the blocks and you're collecting them. So then you just double check that, like, yes, everything is right with the block. It's verified. You can make sure that they didn't try to produce multiple blocks. That would be called equivocation, Dave equivocation. But so basically, as a validator, you're just validating that the other validators are doing their job correctly. Then you add it on to that block to the end of the chain that you consider the best. So again, different validators may have different ideas of what's the best chain. But after finalization, that should not occur. Just very briefly, how we're getting randomness is that we're reaching back into what happened over previous epochs and hashing together all of these other VRF function results, okay? And then creating our own hash from them. So it is deterministic based on what already exists, which means that others can verify that that is the value you should be using. All right, so I know that's been a lot, so I'm going to take a little pause here. No questions? All right. So one of the problems here, if you see, I'm creating all of these blocks for the slots, but sometimes there may be a long period of time with no blocks. And what we try to do with Polkadot is we want to have a pretty consistent block production time of about 6 seconds. Again, this is modifiable, but generally you have a pretty short amount of time. But if a slot goes by and there's no one creating the blocks for that slot, well, then nothing happens. It's just like, in Bitcoin, sometimes it takes a really long time for someone to find a valid block. We want to avoid that. So there's been an adjustment made to Babe. So what I've discussed already is basic Babe. We've added some adjustments to make sure that we have a constant block time. That is, there will always be a block produced for a given slot. So the second thing we do is validators are going to use this deterministic function to basically go round robin to figure out if it's their turn to make a secondary block. So a secondary block is I think of it as like a weak block or a lightweight block. So it's outweighed by a primary block. So if someone that was chosen by the sort of traditional Babe mechanism is in the same slot, your block is sort of beaten out by it. However, it does make sure, because all of these validators are sort of taking turns producing the secondary block, that there will be a block. If no primary block is created for the slot, at least there's a secondary block that can be added to the chain to make sure that we have one block every 6 seconds. So now, I apologize. I did have different colors for these. I don't know why they're not showing up on here. So we saw those secondary smaller blocks. Again, they're kind of hard to see because for some reason the color is different, but you can see they're smaller. Those smaller blocks will never be included as if there is a primary block in that same slot. But they act as a backup to make sure that for every slot there will be some block. So it's kind of a neat adjustment to make sure that our system can have consistent block times. This does make a difference to our simple best chain decision, because now instead of just the longest chain after the last finalized grandpa block, we want the longest chain with the most primaries on the last finalized grandpa block. So here, for instance, the top chain is the longest chain, but it only has one primary in it. It has all secondaries. It only has one primary and the rest secondaries, rather. The middle chain is on the last finalized block, and it has 3 primaries. Even though it's the shortest chain, since it has the most primaries, it is now the longest. The one at the bottom, even though it has more primaries, it's not built on the last finalized block, so it doesn't count. It's entirely out of the running. All right, so that was Babe. Let's move on to Grandpa. So whereas Babe is how Polkadot and Kusama produce blocks, Grandpa is how they're finalized. Finalization assures you that your block is in the canonical blockchain. So again, if you think of Bitcoin, how you say that, well, if something has been, a transaction is 6 blocks deep, the chances of it being overridden are just incredibly astronomically small. So if we think of that as sort of an ersatz version of finalization, right? That once it's so deep that it's not going to be reverted. Think of this as a more provable way of doing this. So remember, Bitcoin, it's only probabilistic finality. We actually can prove the finality here. So as I already mentioned, we already have mechanisms for provable and accountable finality. And one of the ways that we can do this, and there are obviously other ways of doing this, and just so you know, I'm doing a little bit of hand waving here on the specifics. But we know the size of the validator set. We know they should have roughly equal stake. So one way is to have a supermajority of validators, that is 2/3 of validators, sign off that this block is finalized. Okay. Again, the number 2/3, there are some specific reasons for that we're not going to go into too much. If you look up the paper on Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance, you can read more detail on that. The problem is this is vulnerable to stalling, especially in the event of network partition, which is something that we do have to worry about when we're running any sort of distributed system. Again, we need a 2/3 agreement of validators. We can have up to 1/3 of them either ignoring us or just hanging out and doing whatever. So there are other BFT systems that operate like this. Basically, if every red line is sort of a finalization checkpoint, after block 0, we see our 2/3 of the validators, or the stake rather, sign off on this. If so, we can now generate block 0 and finalize it. Then generate block 1 and finalize it. We can see at 1 produced 2 different possibilities, but we very quickly sort of head this off at the pass. So unlike with Babe, where you could have, or a proof of work system like Bitcoin with Nakamoto consensus, where you could have these long chains you're operating externally, you're not really going to see that with BFT, because at every block we're making sure that it's finalized. So we produce and finalize, produce and finalize, produce and finalize. So you are always going to be very consistent, right? So until something is you're not going to see these long, inconsistent chains. So you're very quickly going to know that something is finalized. But as I mentioned, there are problems with this. So let's say right here, after block 2 is finalized, but before block 3 is finalized, we have some major network hiccup or some perhaps attack on the network, and 40% of validators somehow go offline. We're incommunicado with them. Well, now we are stalled. We can't go any further than this because we will never get 2/3 of the validators. We don't know that they're just temporarily offline or not. So we are now stalled. We can no longer finalize, which again, very, very bad problem with the blockchain. We want to be very highly available. So with hybrid consensus, what we're doing, what we may see is that this 3A, 4A, 5A, and 3B, 4B, 5B, these blockchains continue, perhaps on different sides of the network break, but production continues. So again, there's availability, but at the cost of consistency. All right, so that's why I said it's not as though we're violating the cap theorem here, but rather we are falling back, I guess you could say. If we can't have consistency, at least we can have availability. But generally, we would like to have consistency. When the network reforms or reattaches, the partition closes, then we can continue actually finalizing from there. We can determine after there was that network hiccup, which is the canonical chain. So here we've decided that the A chain is canonical. And then once again, Babe is producing the new block, so we may have these small forks as different validators produce different blocks in a slot. So this doesn't seem like it would be a huge amount of work to finalize a few blocks. But what if this were something much larger? If there was, we were offline for a long period of time. So this is the cool part of Grandpa. So if we think of a blockchain as a tree, sort of put it on its side, we can say that any chain is going to have a common ancestor, right? No matter either if I'm on 18 or 10, 3 is our common ancestor. Or if I'm at 13 and 10, 3 is our common ancestor. 19 and 22, 1 is our common ancestor. So if I keep going back in time, eventually I'll get, at a bare minimum, back to Genesis. There was some sort of fork. However, if we look at this the opposite way, all chains have a common ancestor, but no conflicting chain will have a common descendant. So if I'm at 11, I'm on that chain. If I think that chain, the 0, 1, 3, 11 to 19, I'm looking at that. I'm never going to see 8, 9, 10, 14, 15, 16, 4, 5, 6, 20, 21, 22. I will never see something that conflicts in my history or as a descendant of me. So this actually gave Alistair on our team an idea of really what makes Grandpa Grandpa. So while other systems would have to go back and look through all of the blocks to make sure that they're on the canonical path, what he realized with Grandpa is that if we finalize 10, this implicitly finalizes everything back to 0. So future Babe blocks will now be built on top of the 0 to 10 chain. And this can be done much, much more quickly than traditional systems. It's extremely fast, even when there are a very large number of blocks and differences. So this is kind of what is the special sauce for Grandpa. So this is how the system works under normal circumstances. So So I see there are a few questions, and I'm going to pause and take them now. Oh, this is a good question. So how was randomness generated in epoch 0 and 1, because there wasn't epoch n-2? I feel like I should know this, and I can't remember off the top of my head. I apologize. There are other inputs for randomness. I just can't remember. If you can do me a favor and either email me or ping me in Riot, I will be happy to answer that. I just need to go reread the paper. I just can't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I know. I feel bad. I should know that. I just I'm drawing a blank, and I don't want to give you the wrong answer. So how long could a stall persist? Will the stall of the chain continue until there is 2/3 supermajority? And yes, a stall could continue theoretically indefinitely. So what you'll see is other systems. So what I just said, that it could continue indefinitely, people also realize that is a possible problem. So under a very basic PBFT system, that stall could continue indefinitely. However, different systems out there do have ways around that, like basically timeouts, and we consider that if someone hasn't interacted or some tokens haven't interacted in a certain amount of time, that they're no longer considered part of that network, and so it will basically shrink over time until once again there is a 2/3 supermajority. But the stalling could happen for some large amount of time. But as I said, there are ways around that. I was speaking like the very basic concept of it. Can you put that in the question? Actually, I'll do that. So what's the throughput of the network, let's say with one, I assume that's 1 million validators. Yeah, please put that in the question box, because that way we can link right to it when the video goes out. So what's the throughput of the network, let's say with 1 million validators? So first off, there's a limited number of validators. I can't imagine there will ever be 1 million. The amount of communication, if memory serves, is something like n², which means that this would be a huge amount of communication. We're looking to start with something like 50 to 100 validators at Kusama, and then maybe up to 1,000 for mainnet Polkadot. The specific throughput is going to vary, especially based on the parameters that are configurable in the via governance. So if you were here for my governance talk, or if you've done some research into governance, exactly how much can fit in the block and how big blocks can be is modifiable. And so you can actually, using governance on chain, modify it. But I think like the sort of the broader answer, and this gets a little bit off off topic, is that we anticipate that the relay chain itself, where this is going to happen, is not going to be the main carry or throughway, I guess, the main highway for transactions or data. That's the whole concept of having parachains, is that we can move a lot of that data onto their own parachains, and then use the relay chain only for sharing security and keeping track of the state of the parachains. So because of that, and then because these parachains can themselves be relay chains, creating a sort of like domino effect, I guess is a good way to say it, the scalability can really increase pretty dramatically. So the throughput, that means that we can have, unlimited is a strong word, but basically indefinite throughput by making sure that things are shunted onto the right parachains and that we have the right parachains running. So I'm going to copy the questions people have asked and into the questions and answers box here so that I can link to them. So Bay produces more blocks than Grandpa finalized. There are some blocks with the same transaction, or the transaction comes true in the finalized block only. Well, that depends upon, you could have multiple transactions in different blocks before there's been finalization, but finalization should always be canonical and shouldn't conflict. And so you won't, once something has been finalized, you won't see the you won't see anything that conflicts with the transaction, because anything on that chain couldn't have conflicted. Okay. But what you might see is with Babe, if you're on opposite sides, or if you have a validator that's producing blocks on top of it, there may be the same transaction in multiple blocks. Both of them saw the transaction and just packaged them up in different blocks. But by the time that gets to finalization, there should be one canonical copy of that transaction. So do the validators have to know the other validators? So I'm not sure what exactly you mean by know. They do need to be able to communicate in order to, they check on each other, they do the proofs, they need to have some way to connect over the network, but there's no need to know any sort of information about them other than that they are part of the active validator set and double checking what they produce. So how can one become a validator, and what's the shortest, longest amount of time they can remain a validator? So you can become a validator by staking. If you do and running a validator, so you're going to need to run a. Sorry, I forgot to click the button. So to become a validator, you will have to stake dots and run a validator node. The shortest amount of time, theoretically, you could be a validator. If you get added, so new validators are selected every era, which is about every day. But theoretically, you could be selected to be part of the active validator set and then immediately do something malicious and get slashed and kicked off. So you would be around for one slot. But generally, assuming you weren't doing anything bad, the minimum amount of time would be one era, which is a day. The longest amount of time is as long as you're in the active validator set. That is, the top N staked validators get to be part of the active validator set. Okay? So as long as you are part of that, you can continue being a validator. So how can I be sure my transaction is going to come true when some blocks for Babe are not going to be finalized? So you won't, there is still like an implicit probabilistic finality, right? So you will have there will be very few instances where your let me start over. Your transaction should be will be in the block that hasn't been finalized, right? So at this point, theoretically, it could not be in the other block. Perhaps there was some network issue and the other validator didn't see it, and you could resubmit it. But it's very similar to Bitcoin, where if you submit a transaction and it doesn't get into a block, it's probably sitting, or one on the canonical chain, then it's almost definitely sitting out there as part of the transaction pool for those validators that haven't yet created a block. So those ones that see some other aspect of the history, they're going to add it to the block. So it would be extremely, extremely rare that something is, you submit a transaction and it doesn't get into a block. So, but if you really want to make sure that it's definitely part of the canonical chain, and again, the chances that it won't be are just astronomically small, but you just have to wait until finalization occurs. Again, if you are in a situation where finalization has stalled, which generally should be very, very rare, but you'll have to realize at that point that you don't have this guarantee that the blocks that you're following are canonical. Now, in practice, one, as I mentioned, this is going to be extremely rare, and two, there are a lot of other ways that you will get your transaction into a block as long as it gets communicated to all the validators. But you will know once it's been finalized that it is definitely part of the canonical chain. Again, this is very similar to in Bitcoin, how you have to wait 6 transactions to be very sure that it definitely sure that it's in. All right, someone asked about Babe. I want to know if the lottery and time window validators have to produce blocks are configurable, or are those supposed to be adjusted by the Polkadot governance committee? So it's interesting because the answer is both, right? Because all the governance committee, the only powers really that they have once the network, as we've already seen on Kusama, once it transitions to proof of stake, the ways to modify the chain are through the standard governance window. So the Polkadot Council, it's a little bit easier for them to pass referenda that have proposals that modify these values, but ordinary users can also submit a proposal, get it accepted as a referendum, and vote to modify these parameters. So again, once you get into the actual, the proof of stake system, with governance, anyone is going to be able to modify these things. And you actually know that it's modifiable because it is part of the substrate runtime module library, which compiles down to the WASM that is running. So the WASM bytecode is what's running the blockchain. And any of this WASM bytecode is modifiable via governance. So you can issue, can, as a DOT holder or Kusama token holder, can issue a proposal to modify these if we think that epochs should be longer, for some reason, or we need more slots, or we want to adjust the times, right? That 6 seconds is too short, and so we're getting too many some partitions. Why don't we do 10 seconds or something like that? That is something that you, as a DOT holder or Kusama token holder, you can actually propose to change that. The Polkadot Council, can also submit a proposal to do this. And the only difference, it's the same basic process. They're going to have to submit a proposal, get it accepted as a referendum, have it voted upon by the DOT holders. It's really just mathematically a little bit easier for them to get something passed. And I talk a little more in depth about this in the governance proposal, in the governance talk that I gave last week. Or if you look at the Polkadot wiki, wiki.polkadot.network, and just do a search for governance, you can see some more details about that. And of course, I'm always happy to answer questions on Riot. If you see me around, I'm Bill Pipe W3F. All right, lots of good questions. So I've got one last very, very small section to cover before we end. So what happens if someone tries to cheat? So you've probably heard of slashing. So if you are running a validator and you do something malicious or otherwise detrimental to the network, the major one being equivocation. That is, if in a single slot you try to create 2 different blocks, or you try to finalize 2 conflicting chains, you get penalized. And something that's interesting is that how the validators do this information about potential penalties, it's kept off chain. The validators are communicating with each other. So somebody asked, do the validators have to know each other? And I said, well, they do have to communicate. And part of that is that they sort of keep tabs on each other to make sure that they're following the rules. And they keep that off chain, because if forks are created, we need data that's not kept on chain, because there could be multiple versions of history according to the chain. But it turns out that no matter what chain ends up being finalized, because of this design, you can be slashed on that chain. And this has actually been proven. If you go to research.polkadot.network, you can read, if you read the Grandpa paper, you can see how we can make sure that things are slashed if you try to equivocate, no matter what chain you use. All right, so that was the last thing I wanted to mention. I talked more about slashing in my running a validator talk, but I did want you to sort of know that it's not that just we trust that people are going to follow all of these protocols out of the goodness of their heart, but rather they actually, they're putting up their own stake and they can be taken away from them if they try to cheat. All right, are there any last questions before we end the talk? All right, I don't see any, but we had a lot of good questions already. This talk will be, it's been recorded, and so it will be posted online. I think Hutch will do that and let people in the channels know. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on Riot or just ask in the Polkadot water cooler, and I'm sure someone can help you out. All right, thank you very much.